8:52 a.m. Eastern Time. Inside a secure communications room in Washington, a social media post is drafted, reviewed, and approved short. Controlled, but loaded with consequence. Donald J. Trump announces the extension of the Iran ceasefire, but not indefinitely, not unconditionally. Attached to it is one demand, a unified proposal. Signal number one. Because that phrase changes everything. It means no more fragmented offers, no more partial responses, no more delay tactics. One deal, one position, one answer. Here's what nobody is telling you. This is not a concession. It's a deadline disguised as flexibility. Because while the ceasefire is extended, the pressure has not been reduced. It has been concentrated. Out in the Persian Gulf, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group remains on station. Air wing readiness, under 10 minutes. Escort vessels, 4 guided missile destroyers. Tomahawk inventory across the group, estimated 300 plus missiles. Each one assigned to a target set, already mapped, already verified, already ready. Because extending a ceasefire does not mean standing down. It means holding position. And holding position under tension is one of the most unstable states in military strategy. By 9:24 a.m., the message reaches Tehran. Not through headlines, not through television, through internal channels, direct, analyzed immediately, because the wording matters. Unified proposal. That implies something specific, that Iran must align internally, resolve its own divisions, present one coherent position. And that may be the hardest part of this entire process. Signal number two. Because inside Iran, there is no single voice. There are multiple centers of influence, political leadership, religious authority, military command, and each one has different priorities. Some want relief, economic stability, sanctions lifted. Others want leverage, strategic flexibility, regional influence preserved, and those priorities do not always align. But here's the catch. Without alignment, there is no deal. By 10:11 a.m. in Islamabad, the indirect negotiation channel reactivates, not formally, quietly. Because despite public statements, communication never fully stops. It just changes form. The U.S. delegation remains in its compound. The Iranian delegation remains across the city. Distance unchanged, approximately 11 kilometers. And once again, messages begin to move through a third party, the courier. And what he carries now is not a proposal. It's a framework, a structure that demands response. But we'll come back to him. Because at 10:42 a.m., the first reaction emerges online. Leaks, anonymous, but detailed. They suggest that the U.S. is offering limited sanctions relief, between $10 and $12 billion in accessible funds, in exchange for a freeze on enrichment above 20%. Not rollback, freeze, and that distinction matters, because a freeze preserves capability. It does not eliminate it, it delays it. And delay is the objective. But here's the catch. Delay is not resolution. It compresses future risk, because when the freeze ends, everything resumes. Faster. More intense, more dangerous. By 11:36 a.m., the Iranian side begins to respond, not with a final answer, with questions, clarifications, conditions, because Tehran is not rejecting the framework, but it is not accepting it either. It is reshaping it, trying to extract more value, or relief, more flexibility, and that creates movement, but not closure, because the gap remains, and that gap is narrowing, but not closed. Out in the region, the chain reaction remains the central concern. If the ceasefire holds, markets stabilize, oil remains under control, shipping continues. But if it breaks, even briefly, the domino effect begins. The Strait of Hormuz becomes contested. Oil spikes toward 180, then 220. Global markets react. The S&P 500 drops 10 to 15% in under 48 hours. Fuel prices surge worldwide. Inflation returns, and suddenly, this is not just a regional issue, it's global. That's not speculation, that's what officials are saying privately. But here's the catch. The ceasefire extension does not remove that risk, it postpones it. And postponed risk has a way of returning, stronger. By 12:18 p.m., the courier makes his first trip of the new phase. Documents thinner, language sharper, because this is no longer early stage negotiation. This is final stage alignment. Everything now revolves around one question. Can Iran produce a unified proposal? And if it can't, what happens next? Signal number three, because that question has only two answers, yes or no, and each answer leads to a different outcome. By 1:05 p.m., internal friction begins to intensify. Inside Iran, hardliners are already pushing back, arguing that a unified proposal limits strategic flexibility, that it locks the country into a position that may not be advantageous, that it reduces leverage, and those arguments carry weight because they are not ideological, they are strategic. But others argue the opposite, that without unity, there is no deal, And without a deal, the pressure increases, sanctions remain, risk escalates. And that debate is now the center of gravity, not Washington, not Islamabad, Tehran, because the next move will come from there. But here's the catch. Time is not unlimited, because while these discussions continue, the clock is still running, not visible, but real, measured in enrichment rates, measured in readiness cycles, measured in patience, and that clock does not stop. By 2:14 p.m., a second message is delivered. From the U.S. side, more direct than before, it emphasizes the timeline, the need for clarity, the expectation of response, and that increases pressure, because clarity forces decision, and decision carries consequence. By 3:02 p.m., the system begins to converge, not fully, but noticeably. Positions align slightly, language softens slightly, because both sides understand what is at stake, not just the deal, the alternative. And the alternative is not theoretical. It is planned, prepared, ready. Because if the ceasefire fails, if the unified proposal does not materialize, the next phase begins. And that phase is not diplomatic. It is operational. Military assets move, strike packages activate, targets lock. And once that process begins, it does not stop easily. So as April 22nd, 2026 unfolds, the situation remains suspended between decision and delay, between pressure and restraint, between diplomacy and escalation. And that suspension is fragile because it depends on one thing, a unified proposal, one document, one position, one answer. And within the next 24 to 72 hours, that answer will arrive, or it won't. And if it does, the ceasefire holds, the system stabilizes, time is extended. But if it doesn't, everything changes, rapidly, irreversibly, because once the ceasefire ends, there is no buffer, no delay, no space, only action. And action has consequences. So now the question is no longer whether a deal is possible. It is. The question is whether it can be unified, because without unity, there is no agreement, and without agreement, there's only one path left, deal or collapse, delay or acceleration, peace or war. At 3:28 p.m. Gulf Standard Time, inside a restricted operations room beneath Iran's Supreme National Security Council headquarters, a draft document is placed on a long wooden table. 3 pages, no signatures, no final language, but one title at the top, Unified Position, Preliminary, Signal number 4, because for the first time, the concept is no longer theoretical. It exists, not complete, not agreed, but real, and that changes the trajectory, because once something exists on paper, it can be debated, modified, accepted, or rejected. But here's the catch. What's inside that document is not aligned. Not yet. The first page focuses on sanctions relief. Numbers are specific. Approximately $12 billion in frozen assets to be released within 30 days. Oil export limits eased from 5 million barrels per day, to nearly 3 million. Access to international banking channels partially restored. That's the economic argument. Stability, relief, time. The second page is different. It addresses enrichment. And the language is far less flexible. A proposed cap at 25%, not 20, not 3, 67, 25. That number matters because it preserves capability, keeps Iran within reach of higher enrichment if needed, maintains leverage, and that is where the friction begins because Washington's threshold is clear. Below 20%, anything above that is unacceptable. Signal number 5, because now the negotiation is no longer abstract. It is numerical, precise, and precision leaves less room for interpretation. But here's the catch. There's a third page, and that page is the most important, but it is also the least complete because it deals with verification, inspections, access, monitoring, and this is where trust becomes critical because verification requires intrusion, access to facilities, data, processes. And intrusion is politically sensitive, especially for hardliners who view it as exposure, as vulnerability, as risk. By 4:02 p.m., the debate intensifies, not publicly, but internally. Voices raised, positions defended, arguments repeated, because this is not just about policy, it's about control, about who defines the terms, about who sets the limits, and when those stakes are high, compromise becomes difficult. But here's the catch. Without compromise, there's no unified proposal, and without a unified proposal, the ceasefire extension becomes meaningless. By 4:37 p.m., a parallel discussion is taking place in Washington. Inside the Situation Room, the same 3 variables are being analyzed: sanctions, enrichment, verification, and the conclusion is consistent. Movement exists, but alignment does not. Not yet. And that creates uncertainty, because movement without alignment can collapse quickly. By 5:11 p.m., another signal appears. Out in the Gulf, a U.S. surveillance drone shifts position. Altitude, 50,000 feet. Range, extended. Coverage area expanded towards southern Iranian coastline. Not aggressive, but noticeable. Signal number 6, because even small adjustments in military posture are interpreted, watched, analyzed, and those interpretations feed back into decision-making, because when one side adjusts, the other side reacts, and reaction creates momentum. But here's the catch. Momentum can be slowed, but only if both sides choose restraint. By 5:48 p.m., the courier is activated again, not for a full exchange, just a clarification, a single question, delivered verbally, no documents, no record. Is 20% flexible? That's the question, and the answer will determine everything, because if it is, a deal becomes possible. If it isn't, the gap remains, and the gap may be too wide to close. By 6:12 p.m., the response is prepared. Not immediate, not simple. Because inside Tehran, that number carries weight, strategic weight, political weight, symbolic weight, and adjusting it is not just technical. It is political. But here's the catch. Politics can change under pressure, and pressure is increasing. By 6:39 p.m., a leak appears. Again, more specific this time. It suggests that Iran may be willing to consider a temporary cap at 20%, but only under strict conditions, faster sanctions relief, limited inspection scope, defined timelines. And that leak spreads fast because it signals something new, flexibility. Not confirmed, not official, but possible. Signal number 7, because possibility is enough to shift momentum, enough to create optimism, enough to keep the process alive. But here's the catch. Leaks are not agreements, they are signals, and signals can change quickly. By 7:08 p.m., the courier receives the updated draft, still incomplete, still contested, but closer than before. And that proximity matters, because as positions move closer, the cost of failure increases. Because now a deal is within reach, and losing something within reach feels different, more significant, more consequential. By 7:42 p.m., the updated draft is delivered. Washington reviews it, analyzes it, breaks it down into components, sanctions, acceptable range, enrichment, borderline. Verification, insufficient. And that assessment leads to a familiar conclusion. Progress, but not enough. Yet. By 8:15 p.m., both sides are facing the same reality. The window is still open, but it is narrowing, because the ceasefire extension is not indefinite. It is temporary, conditional, and conditional timelines create pressure, because they force resolution, one way or the other. By 8:46 p.m., the system begins to converge again, not fully, but enough to suggest direction, because both sides understand the alternative, not abstract, not theoretical, real. If no deal is reached, if the unified proposal fails, the next phase begins. Military posture shifts from readiness to action. Naval forces reposition. Air assets deploy forward. Strike windows open. And once that sequence begins, it does not reverse easily. That's not speculation. That's what officials are saying privately. But here's the catch. It hasn't started? Not yet. Because the ceasefire still holds. And as long as it holds, there is still time. Time to adjust. Time to align. Time to decide. By 9:22 p.m., the final exchanges of the day begin. Short, precise, focused, because everything now revolves around one outcome, a unified proposal. Not perfect, not permanent, but unified. And that requirement is both the solution and the obstacle. Because unity is difficult, especially under pressure, especially with competing priorities, especially when the stakes are this high. So as the day closes, the situation remains unresolved, balanced, fragile, uncertain. Because the answer has not yet been finalized, but it is close, closer than before, and within the next 24 to 72 hours, that answer will emerge. Either the proposal is unified, and the ceasefire holds, or it isn't, and the system shifts, rapidly, decisively, irreversibly, because once the window closes, it does not reopen easily, and what follows will not be negotiation, it will be consequence. So now everything depends on alignment, not between countries, but within them. Because unity is the final requirement, and without it, there is only one path left: deal or collapse, delay. 10:08 p.m. Gulf Standard Time. Inside a secure communications hub just outside Islamabad, a fresh document is printed. Not 3 pages this time, not 2. 1 page, signal number 8. Because when negotiations shrink to a single page, it means one thing. Everything unnecessary has been removed. What remains is the core, the decision. At the top of the page, 3 lines. Sanctions. Relief, $10 billion initial release, expandable. Enrichment cap, 20% maximum with phased reduction review. Verification, limited but immediate inspections, expanded within 60 days. No extra language, no ambiguity, just terms. And those terms are now being carried, once again, by the same courier who has moved between these two sides more than 20 times in the past 48 hours. The third person in the room. The one who never appears in headlines. The one who shapes how messages are delivered. And tonight, his role is no longer just to carry. It's to ensure the message lands exactly as intended. Because tone at this stage matters as much as content. By 10:26 p.m., the document arrives on the Iranian side. No immediate reaction. No visible response. Just review. Careful. Measured. Because this is no longer about negotiation. It's about acceptance or rejection. And those two outcomes are now separated by very little. But here's the catch. Even at this stage, internal resistance has not disappeared. Inside the room, voices remain divided. One group argues this is the best possible outcome under current conditions. Sanctions relief begins immediately. Enrichment remains above civilian levels, at least temporarily. Inspections are limited at first. In their view, this is a strategic pause, a way to stabilize without surrendering capability. But the opposing view is just as strong, that accepting a 20% cap, even temporarily, creates a precedent. That inspections, even limited, open the door to deeper intrusion. That once concessions begin, they expand. And that expansion reduces leverage. Signal number 9. Because this is no longer a technical debate. It's a strategic one, about future positioning, about long-term advantage, about control. By 10:57 p.m., the discussion intensifies. Time is now a factor, not just pressure. Because the longer the decision takes, the closer the system moves to the edge, where default outcomes begin to take over. And default, in this case, is not stability, it's escalation. But here's the catch. Escalation is not automatic. It is triggered. And triggers require action. By 11:18 p.m., another development unfolds outside the negotiation process. In the Persian Gulf, a U.S. destroyer adjusts its patrol zone slightly northward. Distance change, approximately 18 nautical miles. Not aggressive, not defensive, but noticeable. Signal number 10. Because movements like this are tracked in real time and interpreted immediately, inside Iran, that movement is analyzed, assessed, and added to the calculation. Because every signal, military, diplomatic, economic, feeds into the same decision matrix. Accept or reject. By 11:42 p.m., the final internal review begins. No more drafts, no more revisions, just evaluation. Because the document is now fixed. What changes now is the decision. And that decision is binary. There is no middle ground left, no partial acceptance, no delayed response. Because delay itself has become a decision that pushes the system closer to collapse. But here's the catch. Collapse does not happen instantly. It begins with signals, subtle, incremental, until they are no longer subtle. By 11:58 p.m., the room goes quiet. Not empty, but silent. Because the decision has been made, not announced, not communicated, but reached. And now, everything depends on how it is delivered. Because delivery shapes interpretation, and interpretation shapes response. By 12:06 a.m., April 23rd begins. And with it, the most critical phase of this entire process. Because what happens next will not unfold over weeks, or even days. It will unfold over hours. The courier is called in, one final time. He receives the response, sealed, no copies, no leaks. And as he leaves the compound, the entire system shifts into anticipation. Because now the answer exists, but it has not yet been received. And in that gap, anything is possible. By 12:28 a.m., the message arrives. The U.S. side reviews it immediately. No delay, no waiting. Because timing is critical. And as the document is opened, one thing becomes clear. It is not a full acceptance, but it is not a rejection. It is a conditional agreement. Acceptance with adjustments, minor changes, clarifications, requests, but fundamentally, alignment. And that changes everything. Signal number 11. Because now the path forward exists, not finalized, not signed, but reals. And that reality shifts the entire trajectory. Because once both sides are aligned, even partially, the cost of collapse increases dramatically. Because now, failure is not due to impossibility. It is due to decision. And that makes it harder, politically, strategically, psychologically, to walk away. But here's the catch. Even now, it can still fail. Because conditional agreements require follow-through. And follow-through requires trust. And trust is still limited. By 1:02 a.m., the next step is prepared. Not a public announcement. Not yet. A confirmation exchange, Final clarifications, last adjustments. Because even at this stage, details matter, and details can break deals, but they can also secure them. By 1:36 a.m., the system stabilizes temporarily because the immediate risk of collapse has decreased. Not eliminated, but reduced, and that reduction is enough for now. Because it prevents the next phase, the phase that has been planned, prepared, positioned, the phase of escalation. But here's the catch. This is not the end. It is a pause, a structured pause, defined by terms, limited by time, dependent on compliance. And compliance is never guaranteed. By 2:08 a.m., analysts begin to update their models. Short-term escalation risk reduced, medium-term risk unchanged, long-term risk still present. Because the underlying issues remain: enrichment, sanctions, verification, none of them resolved, only managed, only delayed. And delay is not resolution, it is strategy. So as the first hours of April 23rd unfold, the system moves into a new phase, not crisis, not stability, something in between. Controlled tension, managed risk, conditional peace, and that state is fragile because it depends on continued alignment, continued restraint, continued communication, and those conditions are not permanent. They require maintenance constantly, because if they break, if alignment collapses, if restraint fails, if communication stops, the system returns to the previous path, rapidly, unpredictably, irreversibly. And that path leads to only one place. So now the next 24 to 72 hours become critical, not for negotiation, but for confirmation, for testing the agreement, for verifying compliance, for ensuring that what has been agreed is actually followed. Because that will determine everything, whether this moment becomes a turning point or just a delay. Because in the end, there are still only two outcomes: stability or escalation, deal or collapse, delay or acceleration, peace or war.